Corona Poetry, Echoes of the Great War, Women Poets of the First World War through the lens of Corona Poets, on the dark side of the world. Part 1. These days are scary times. Amidst all the Corona news, tweets and updates, I forgot that April is National Poetry Month. Yet, living on what artist Yayoi Kusama terms the dark side of the world, has prompted many people to express their emotions in poetry. Soon after the epidemic broke in China, a nurse, Wei Shuyin's Please Don't Disturb experienced multiple shares and was subsequently taken down by the authorities. NHS surgeon Jo Cook boosted staff morale with her poem that opens by reminding them, Corona used to be a beer, they garnish it with limes. Emergency room Dr. Elizabeth Mitchell from Boston, who believes that poetry allows doctors to become better listeners, shared her fears as she prepares to work the battleground of a corona ward. Just as happened in the Great War, readers like Miss N. Hamner are sending in poems to their local newspaper. US teacher Jessica Salfia constructed a poem for our times, using the first lines of emails she received whilst quarantining. Tory Will's chilling stay at home is a gut-wrenching reminder to all of us of why this directive was issued and raises questions about why it was not enforced sooner. County Durham mum Gemma Peacock assures her young sons that they will be remembered as the Rainbow Children, and, echoing so many of us, Yayoi Kusama sends deep gratitude to all who are fighting. So, with the internet apparently awash with poetry, an obvious choice for this week's chat, linking what is happening now with 1914-1918 is women. Yes, you did hear that correctly, women's World War I and women's Corona poetry, because, almost spookily, so many of the words and sentiments expressed today echo those written a century ago. My ongoing love affair with the women war poets began decades ago. Like countless others, I had always, wrongly as it turned out, assumed that the so-called war poets were exclusively male. Then, one day, I made an unexpected discovery. 583 of the 2,000 British poets whose work was published during the Great War were women. Part 2. 583 British women poets. Although initially I was amazed by this figure, it soon became obvious that women must have written about this first total war. If war, or in our situation, Corona poetry, is a response to intense emotions, it would have been deeply surprising if women had not written poetry then, as they are indeed doing now. As I began delving more deeply into this hugely under-researched area, I realised that, again like Corona poems, women's poetry reflected women's wartime lives and wondered if it would be possible to explore the Great War through the eyes and lives of its women poets. I hope the historians of tomorrow will use today's poems to gain additional understanding of how we are coping with self-isolation, social distancing, and of course, fear and grief. Until the reality of Corona death struck, it was easy to disregard ICU sister Tory Will's poeticized pleas to stay home. After all, by going out, what harm can it do? In a not dissimilar way, before men left for the front, there were, as Winifred Letts observed, a number of women, children and men, including soldiers who had never been in combat, who think that war is fun. For the vast majority of British women, their first contact with the war was the agonising moment of bidding farewell to a beloved family member. The moment that brought home to them, just as the very first UK corona cases did to us, that this was real. Multiple poems on the theme of departure take us to the heart of the women's war. In August 1914, Winifred Letts saw the troops leaving for France. Against the beating of the martial drum, there's a woman sobs her heart out with her head against the door, for the man that's called to leave her. God, have pity on the poor. If Winifred was an observer, in late February 1915, Alexandra Grantham experienced the second of 3 departures of the men in her family. With her husband already in France, he was killed in May 1915, her son Hugo left for the Mediterranean front. Fighting both fears and tears, she advises mothers whose sons towards far fights are starting, by the loud train be mirth, not moan of fears. The green flag waves, the white steam hisses, love's last fond greetings waved with trembling hands. Only when the train has steamed away can the woman allow herself the release of tears. Other women knew that they had insufficient self-control. Their farewell would take place in the privacy of the home, for not all can be the heroine that others are. I wonder if parents today have written about their fears as their daughter or son begins a long, potentially life-endangering stint on the wards, or indeed any of the duties our key workers are undertaking. Boston doctor Elizabeth Mitchell admits to anxiety for herself as, "I prepare to work the battleground of Corona." Workers Wanted, Part 3. As soon as Great Britain entered its lockdown, a plea went out to those who could volunteer to assist either the NHS or lend a helping hand to those in the community, as Miss N. Hamner points out in her poem published in the Oxford Mail. Well, this is nothing new. The same happened in World War I. Women in the Great War are invariably associated with knitting. Lord Kitchener was only too aware that the hundreds of thousands of men who agreed that your country needs you needed socks. Lots of them, 300,000 pairs to be precise, by Christmas. He at least realised that the war wouldn't be over by then. Supported by Queen Mary, an appeal went out to the women of the empire. Idle moments would no longer be tolerated. Instead, do your bit, knit a stitch. By November 1914, English women and children, supported by those in the Dominions, had produced over 700,000 pairs of socks, as well as thousands of other knitted garments. Indeed, Australian sheep became slightly concerned. Mary had a little lamb. Its fleece was quite expensive. It followed her to school one day and came home feeling pensive. The little maids at school that day forgot their sums and letters. They pulled the wool all off its back and knit it into sweaters. Knitting could, of course, be therapeutic. As one poet observing her mother poignantly noted, "It's not a sock she's knitting, it's a web of love for him." By 1915, not unlike today's PPE crisis, England was facing a munitions one. Now the women of England had to become the girl behind the man behind the gun. For some women, factory work offered real opportunities for self-improvement. After years of skivvying and working as low-paid servants, a job in a munitions factory promised better wages, the acquisition of skills, and earned them short-lived praise from a grateful nation. Reminding me of the poem that has been going around on the internet, "You Clap for Me Now," constructed through the voices of immigrants who are propping up our hospitals or working as delivery drivers bringing food for our families. Let us hope that the gratitude they receive extends beyond an 8 p.m. clap on Thursday evenings. Post-war, the munitions workers received a War Service Medal and precious little else. Black humour, so much a part of trench life, also occurred in the factories where explosions and fatalities became all too familiar. Perhaps to hide grief for comrades, one worker at the Dornoch factory in Scotland explained how 3 little Dornoch girls went to work quite new. The acid fumes did smother one, and then there were 2. Some poets were affronted by women's involvement in the armament factories. They believed that women's hands should minister unto the flame of life, not manufacture the weapons of death. Others acknowledged that without the factory hands who helped to win the war, there would have been no victory. Part 4. Volunteers' verses. Unsurprisingly, many poems, both Corona and Great War ones, relate to nursing, amongst the most moving being by the Chinese nurse with the pen name Wei Shuyin, who worked in Wuhan. What is frequently overlooked is that in war, the medical service's first duty is to return a man to the front line. Some poet nurses dare to express doubts about their role, for if she is faithful to her trust, she will simply send a man back to satisfy the lust of the war machine. Eva Dobell, who was a volunteer nurse, wonders if it might have been better in that grim trench to die than drag maimed years out endlessly. Those of us familiar with the images of the wounded, the maimed, and the shell-shocked of the First World War may well agree. Today, an army of volunteers is supporting the NHS in multiple roles. In the Great War, thousands also volunteered to support professional nurses. Tensions could arise between the professional nurses and the volunteers, or VADs as they were called. The mother of one VAD wrote a poem to cheer up her daughter Grace, who was variously referred to as valueless a duffer or very active danger. She understood why in her unflattering uniform Grace might have felt virtuous and dumpy, but reminded her that at least in the eyes of her very own soldier she was verily a darling. Her attempts to be valiant and determined were so impressive that they married after the war. Whilst the majority of VADs worked as auxiliary nurses, some received additional training, which also found its way into their poetry. One who eventually sat the examinations of the Society of Apothecaries captured her time in her hospital's dispensary with its glistening salts and shimmering scales and crystals of purest white, high on the shelves in their spotless rows, enclosed in their bottles bright, heavy syrups, thick and sweet, prepared with skill and toil. The poet's name might be familiar to you, Agatha Christie. Agatha Christie's pharmaceutical work may have held a certain glamour, and it certainly equipped her to use poison in her detective novels. A bit like hospital cleaners today, those known as general service VADs performed more mundane tasks, often at ungodly hours of the day. One such memorialised her most hated chore in her Ode to a Gas Oven. Goodbye at 5, to sleep so sweet. At earliest dawn we used to meet, for you, my friend, I had to greet about 5:30, and on flu days twice weekly treat. You were so dirty. Another ancillary, Winifred Wedgwood, pleads for her colleagues, the scullions, not to be forgotten as nurses took centre stage. Our nurses are always apparent, so we give them their halos all right. But how many think of our scullions because they work buried from sight? Over in France and Free Belgium, other British women were doing their bit, including the members of the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry. This unit had been formed pre-war with the optimistic idea that the Fannies, as they were affectionately dubbed, would gallop onto the battlefield to rescue casualties and gallop back, dragging a stretcher behind them. Well, the realities of the Western Front were such that galloping on horseback proved a bit of a non-starter. So, ever adaptable, these upper-class women transformed themselves into ambulance drivers, initially with the Belgian and eventually the British and French armies. Dedicated, determined and dauntless, showing superb driving skills and utter disregard for their own safety. They tell harrowing stories about driving cargoes of wounded in all weathers and across all terrains. Fannies saw action in both the First and the Second War, and they remain in existence today. I don't know if today's Fannies are budding poets, but their foremothers were, often giving humorous accounts of life then and now. One wished my mother could see me now with a grease gun under my car, filling my differential ere I start for the sea afar. The conditions that the women worked in were often mentally and physically overwhelming, just as our Chinese nurse noted in Wuhan. Weary all day, all night, rest, sleep. This is more important than your praise. Exhausted or not, at least one little Fanny, going back to Blighty, was determined to enjoy her leave. She stopped in Paris on the way to buy a naughty nightie. Whilst most British women served in France or Flanders, some headed to the war's now overlooked theatres, Serbia, Salonika and the Russian front. The best known are the Scottish Women's Hospital units for foreign service. Like Wei, who moved by a healer's conscience, travelled the 1,350 kilometres to Wuhan from a home in Gansu province, these medical women nursed in places so distant that many had never heard of them before the war. By 1919, the 14 Scottish Women's Hospital units and their hundreds of female volunteers had served in all theatres of war. The unit administrator, Mary Henderson, shows her boundless admiration for her many colleagues nursing in seemingly impossible conditions. I've seen you kneeling on the wooden floor, tending your wounded on their straw-strewn bed, heedless of how on these fronts women were so close to the front line that aeroplane duels were fought, quite literally, over their heads, endangering lives and, to the unit's cook, outrage, the patient's lunch. Part 5. Life on the home front. With so much media coverage of empty supermarket shelves, unsurprisingly, this has found its way into poems, including East Kent surgeon Joe Cook's Shops Stripped Bare by Panic Buying, as well as Dr. Elizabeth Mitchell's Empty Rows Where Toilet Paper Stood in Upright Ranks. Poetic anxieties about food and other supplies are nothing new. There is even a reference to Great War toilet paper angst when, using contemporary slang, fruitless hunts for Isel, the Andrex of its day, took the cake. Like Tory Wills, who rightly accuses so many of us as going to the shops, touching so many spots, Great War poet Marjorie Stone took contemporary panic buyers to task. One day this shop, then another, whilst others stand in a queue from Monday morning to Saturday night, so that I and mine can eat in safety. By 1917, Britain's food stocks were at crisis level. Mirroring the call for additional supermarket workers and delivery drivers, another army was needed. This had to be a feminine one. From across the British Isles, women responded and joined the Women's Land Army. We were summoned from the city, from the cottage and the hall, from the hillside and the valley. We answered to the call, for we're fighting for our country as we till the fertile soil. The pay was poor, the hours long, the work arduous and lonely. Perhaps that sounds a bit like the self-distancing of the delivery drivers today, as the email sent to Jessica Salfia reminds, free curbside pickup or ship to your house. In terms of the WLA or the Women's Land Army, one member wondered if, after her brief training, she would be up to the job. I'm a-thinking of the farm where I'll be sent, of the lonely little furrow where my days will oft be spent. Reminding of our supermarkets and other key workers' Herculean efforts to restock the shelves after the days of panic buying, the Women's Land Army successfully won the war against starvation. Whilst the members of the Land Army poetically ploughed their lonely furrows, and the nation shared recipes for such culinary delights as Brussels sprout puree, which perhaps the person who sent the email to Jessica Salfia asking if she were willing to share your ideas and solutions might not have enjoyed, other poets turned for inspiration to the land of their birth and hoped that images of their homeland might sustain those who were fighting. Just as Dr. Elizabeth Mitchell took comfort from noting, a daffodil has poked its head up, Caroline Renshaw hoped that visions of their misty, sea-girt island in the sunset-haunted west would comfort the wounded and dying. Others recognised that although the land war was being fought across the Channel, those living in England's green and pleasant land were themselves in a new firing line. The skies, hitherto God's last area free from vice, initiate an aerial mine with babes below as sacrifice. Death would henceforth rain down from the skies in what has been referred to as the First Battle of Britain. Part 6. Over There. Just as we who are healthy are finding it hard to fully comprehend the realities on the corona wards, chillingly described by Tory Wills as nightmares that are no longer inconceivable, those at home in World War I struggled to picture the true horrors of what was happening over there. However, countless nurses experienced it at first hand, including a woman who, in my unbiased opinion, was the finest war poet of either gender. I'd like to tell you about her. In 1913, Vassar educated and unhappily married Mary, known as May Borden, was living in London with her British husband. In August 1914, she volunteered with the French Red Cross, despite having no nursing skills and only a basic knowledge of French. Her can-do attitude was such that she felt neither of these gaps in her CV created insurmountable barriers. In January 1915, she went to Dunkirk to train in a French hospital housed in a former casino where hideously wounded and mortally sick French soldiers were being, and I hardly like to use the word nursed, in conditions that resembled those of the Crimea War. Deeply shocked by what was going on, and having fallen foul of the French nursing authorities for what we would now call whistleblowing, she hatched a plan to develop her own unit, which, being fabulously wealthy, she would, initially at least, fund. This would be embedded with the French army, and she would be the director. She estimated that the initial cost would be about £4,000 with running costs of £200 a month. In order to help kickstart this idea that was obsessing her, she relinquished the lease on her Park Lane house and sold all the furniture. I don't know if her husband, serving as an interpreter with the Indian Army, knew this. Putting a spin on the idea of being a tax exile, she moved herself, her fortune, and her 3 daughters to Paris, thereby relinquishing membership of the British Tax Club. A small footnote is that by the end of the war, her massive fortune had all but evaporated. By July 1916, May's Hospital de l'Évacuation was at Bray-sur-Somme. It became one of the most important military hospitals in France, with a ringside view of one of the biggest advances in warfare when, in September 1916, she saw the first tanks ever to be used trundling down the road at nearby Flers. She immortalized these obscene crabs, armoured toads, crushing under their belly whatever stood in their way. By now, May's Hospital had become a city of huts, and the guns beyond the hill sound like the waves of the sea, pounding, pounding, and the sky is a whir with aeroplanes. Sometimes we are bombarded, and all the time troops and more troops stream past. Soon, these troops would stream back, disfigured, maimed, and with their wits as shattered as their bodies. I'm sure that May would have echoed Japanese poet Yayoi Kusama's feelings. Now we find ourselves on the dark side of the world. One of the many ironies that did not escape May was that it was women who had become the frontline soldiers in this second battlefield, where women fought to save the lives that the first battlefield had sought to destroy. Meanwhile, May's wartime private life was becoming as tumultuous and in many ways as gender-reversed as her public one. In autumn 1916, a Captain Edward Louis Spears, attached to the staff office and thus serving away from the front line, visited her hospital in an official capacity. Her first glimpse of him was of something rare this close to the Somme front, a whole man with all his limbs, eyes, ears, and even a nose intact and in the right place. His of her was of a small woman in a mud-splattered and blood-stained apron. The sonnet she wrote to the man who would soon become her lover and eventually her second husband encapsulates the gender reversals which infuse her truly magnificent poetry. No, no, there is some sinister mistake. You cannot love me now. I am no more a thing to touch, a pleasant thing to take into one's arms. How can a man adore a woman with black blood upon her face, a cap of horror on her pallid head, mirrors of madness in the sunken place of eyes, hands dripping with the slimy dead? Go. The now shell-shocked May would have recognized the feelings of helplessness poignantly expressed by Wei Shuin. The trembling, the dread, the crying and despair. Please don't disturb me again. Part 7. Grief. While nurses fought their unending battle against death, those at home could only sit and wait. Geographically, they were even further from loved ones than those with relatives in hospital today. Over 700,000 British families received in the Great War the telegram or letter that they had dreaded since he, or sometimes she, had marched off to that beating drum. When the long-dreaded news finally came, many bereaved found an outlet in writing grief poetry for those, to quote Gemma Peacock, whom they loved but could not hold. When German-born Alexandra Grantham bade her son Hugo farewell at the station, did she sense that this would be her last glimpse of him? On June the 28th, 1915, he was killed in Gallipoli. Without even the minimal chilling consolation of listening down the phone as in Tori's words, her son's breath slows down, rattle, and the line goes dead. She could not fold thy stricken hands, I could not close thy broken eyes. Too far, too dead, thy body lies. Young Royal Inniskillen Fusilier John Vincent Toy was killed on the 2nd of July 1915, also in Gallipoli. As her handwritten poem shows, his mother Sarah believed that, had he been buried in his local churchyard in Derry, some comfort then we could have got. We knew where he was laid, bedecked the grave top with our tears and kept it bright arrayed. Like that of so many hundreds of thousands of mothers, Sarah's wish was unfulfilled. His body was never found. He is remembered on the magnificent Helles Memorial in Gallipoli. In September 1917, 29-year-old Second Lieutenant Guy Patterson Cranmer was granted a few days' leave. On the 23rd of September, he married his sweetheart, Elsie Breed. 3 days later, Guy was back at the front. Following his departure, Elsie, already bereaved of 2 brothers, had what she termed a premonition. Suddenly, out of the cold and mist and gloom, a gleam of silver moonlight, you were there beside me in the little narrow room, smiling your old, glad, familiar smile. We mutely kissed, not with the fiery kisses of as of old, but a sad, dumb, pitiful clinging. Suddenly, you drew yourself away from me. Strangely, you fled away into the cold and gloom and mist. And then I knew. A telegram arrived. Guy had been killed on the 9th of October 1917, his body lost in that bitter heaving mud which has become synonymous with the Battle of Passchendaele, a battle which robbed Elsie, as it robbed so many women, including her sister, of the hopes and passions of youth, of never-to-be-fulfilled motherhood, and of a life without the only man she had ever or would ever love. She believed, when the years have flown away and left no single visible trace of all your beauty and your body's grace, and as the last faint, shadowy evening life of life departs from me, O heart I loved, I shall remember then. Elsie never remarried. Instead, she cherished memories of a marriage that had lasted a total of 15 days and of which 72 hours had been spent together. This most terrible battle of 1917 conscripted her into the army of what she accurately dubbed the living dead, an army in which she remained conscripted for the next 60 years. Part 8. A Different World. Finally, after 1,566 days, the war to end war was over. Now, both the bereaved and survivors would have to find ways to, in Jessica Salfier's words, navigate the new normal. Believing in Yayoi Kusama's words, now is the time to overcome, to bring peace. The authorities, including King George V, hoped that one way to help the bereaved to come to terms with their loss would be the burial of an unknown warrior at Westminster Abbey, a ceremony to which bereaved mothers and widows were invited. While the nation held its breath, in the packed streets the women's eyes are red, those hungry eyes of starved mother love that strive to pierce the coffin lid above the nameless envoy of the nameless dead. Meanwhile, the Imperial War Graves Commission was creating the magnificent cemeteries in which the known, and those only known unto God, would be interred. But thousands of bodies had never been found. They too needed fitting memorials, about which, it is worth pointing out, some poets were unenthusiastic. Tory Wills believes memorials can distract, whilst a century ago, considering memorials, Charlotte Mew asserted, God is not mocked, neither are the dead. Nevertheless, on the 24th of July 1927, the Menin Gate, the great memorial to the missing of the Ypres salient, was unveiled. The names carved on the gate's panels of Portland stone are those of the 57,895 officers and men of the Ypres salient whose bodies were either never found or could not be identified. This gate in Ypres was chosen, in the Imperial War Graves Commission's words, because of the hundreds of thousands who passed through it on their way to the battlefields. Whenever I visit the Menin Gate, I think of the words of young volunteer nurse Carola Oman, who worked in the salient, and in the final months of the war and during the reconstruction. She gazed along the Menin Road in 1919. Over the flat, dim land I see you moving, methodically, under a dark, wide sky full of low clouds. You are gone from our loving. No fret of ours or grief can touch you now. The road speaks nothing to our longing now. Yet, I wonder, are you wholly gone? For those of us who visit the battlefields and memorials, for those of us who are still trying to comprehend the magnitude, the horror and the suffering of those tumultuous years, the simple yet powerful lines written by amateur and professional women poets continue to speak to us. Similarly, I am convinced that, when the years have flown, Corona poems will remind those of us who have lived through these epic times of the courage and dedication of the men and women of all nationalities and ethnicities, who put their lives on the line by nursing, delivering supplies or keeping essential services running during what Tory described as a surging tsunami. I would like to echo Yayoi Kusama and send deep gratitude to all those who are fighting. A few days ago, Gemma Peacock from County Durham assured her Rainbow Sons, the history books will talk of now. Just like the poems written between 1914 and 1918 describing what one contemporary referred to as 4 years out of life, I am convinced that the poems being written today will provide future historians with alternative sources which can help them to better understand what it was like to be living in what Gemma described as the time the world stood still. Thank you for listening.